It's my pleasure to introduce one of my colleagues, Natalie Isaac, who is the with MLA's Global Manager for Industry Insights and Strategy. So Natalie leads a team in MLA that's focused on collecting and reporting data and insights right along the supply chain, from slaughter right through to consumer insights and research very much at that consumer end, which of course we all know, but I'll reiterate, and obviously a link to the quality story that's come up this afternoon, but multiple times through the CRC, is that the quality of our sheep meat, lamb and sheep meat products is paramount, because as we all know, money comes from consumers. We don't generate money on farm, we don't generate money earlier in the supply chain. All our money comes from consumers who tip it in the top end of that pipe and it flows down through. So, to put it crudely, we need to make sure our product is up there so we can extract as much money as possible out of those consumers. And to share some insights in that space, Natalie, could you please take the floor?
Good afternoon. Thanks for the introduction. I feel very comfortable that I'm in good company here. For anyone that knows me, and probably not many of you do, I love a bit of data. And that first session, I saw data all over the place. So I'm not going to have as much technical data as what you've seen already. But I will talk about the customer. Here's the start. I'll talk about the customer, and there are a lot of customers along the supply chain, and I'm just talking about one customer in particular, and that's the consumer, the person who eats our high quality Australian lamb. And to talk about that consumer, I'll cover off 3 areas, and hopefully at the end it makes sense why I talked about those 3 areas. So the first one that I'll talk about is the global environment or the global market, followed by the consumer, and this is mostly where is our consumer. And the last one is around connecting it to the farmer. And I don't really need to do too much of a job on that one because Jamie did it for me earlier. Thank you. But that's what we'll go through. So in terms of the global environment, we'll have a quick look at demand, and Jamie did summarise this for us earlier. We'll talk about that changing destination of demand, and we'll also have a look at what our place is in the global environment. Why the global environment? Most of you probably already know around 60% of our lamb and nearly 95% of our mutton is exported to global markets. So global environment's critical for the success of our industry. So if we start with demand, this is having a look at history. And if we have a look at the last 25 years in terms of global sheep meat consumption, it's risen around 50%. In that period, there's only about 5 years where there wasn't an increase year on year. And the good news, and Jamie summarised this earlier, is that the forecast is for demand to increase. And what we know in terms of what drives that demand and why we can feel positive that there will be some demand is things like the population growth. We hear about the growing middle class, and with that comes rising incomes. And what we do know is with rising incomes, we get increased red meat consumption. As positive as all of that sounds, there are also factors that could have an impact on how much that growth happens, or headwinds, if you like. So if we think about that rising demand, what comes with rising demand is rising price and affordability. There's also the political environment. So there's 3 big ones at the moment that most are familiar with. China-US relationships, Brexit, Trump himself, all of those types of factors can have an impact on that global demand. And if we think about where that demand is coming from, the bulk of the demand that in terms of increase historically, looking at the left-hand side, those red bars are coming from the developing market and the green are the developed markets. So pretty much all of the growth is coming from developing markets. And if we have a look at Asia, 62% of all of that growth is coming from Asia. So not surprisingly, the destination of our product or the location of our consumer is changing, and changing fairly rapidly. So when we have a look at Australia's sheep meat exports over time, you can see the proportion that has gone to Asia has doubled. What's also good news is North America has doubled, so one of those developed markets, and the Middle East has grown almost 10%. So we've got increasing demand, and it's coming from different markets. And like I said, global markets are very important to us. So what you're looking at here is on the left-hand side, you're having a look at the countries in terms of the global producers. And you can see Australia up there on the left. We only represent 7% of all sheep meat production. But if you jump across to the right, we represent 39% of global sheep meat exports. So we're relatively small in terms of the production, if you like, but we're a massive player in terms of the global exports. So it just reinforces the importance of those global markets and the global consumer. And what's also been happening over time is our share of those global exports have been growing. So in the last 15 years, our share of global exports has grown about 15%. So in terms of global environment, it's a dynamic world marketplace. There's two major exporters, us and New Zealand. And the destination of demand is changing, but total demand is increasing. So now let's have a little look at the consumer. First, we'll look at the positive, we'll look at the opportunities in terms of consumer opportunities. Then we'll have a look at the challenges in terms of the consumer. And the last thing we'll look at is the target consumer. So where and who are we targeting with our products? So in terms of opportunity, I'll explain what you're looking at first. On the left-hand side in the red, this is some of our consumer research. We research consumers in many markets, and we ask consumers who has recently purchased lamb. And you can see markets like Australia, or the one above, which is Saudi, nearly 90% of consumers have recently bought lamb. But that's not true of all markets. If you have a look at the likes of US, Japan and Korea, less than 50% of people have bought lamb recently. So another thing we look at with our research is, of those who haven't bought lamb, why haven't they bought lamb? And the good news is, it's just that they're not familiar with it. So you've got 29% don't know how to cook, 27% are not familiar, and there's another 27% who say, I don't buy it for home, but I'll try it when I go out, when I'm eating out. So there's a real opportunity here in some markets to grow awareness of lamb, and we know how to do that. It's through education and making it more familiar. But there's also challenges. So Jamie touched on some big future challenges. In terms of the biggest existing challenge for our consumers, the biggest one is price. So as much as the demand is increasing, which is a great thing, it means that the price to the consumer is also increasing. So looking at the last 5 years in terms of the consumer price, sheep meat's been at about a 200% premium to pork and poultry. So from a consumer point of view, we have an expensive product, and for the consumer's point of view, we need to justify why they pay such a large premium when they choose to consume this protein. And our other big short-term challenge is obviously our supply. So we're obviously coming into, in the short term, a period of reduced supply. And that's important for many reasons. This chart is showing of all of the markets that import sheep meat, what proportion Australia represents of those imports. What you can't see really obviously on this slide is that our production, based on the current demand, would never fulfil all of this demand. So we are able to be selective in terms of who we target. And this is really important because not all of the opportunities are equal. There's a lot of commodity product in some of these markets, and we're not competing with that product. We're a premium product. So our job to do is to find where those premium consumers are who will pay for a premium product. And we happen to know that. So this is just one example. This is for the Middle East. We have this type of information for all developing markets, and I would love to talk about that for a very long time. But given the time constraints, it's a good example of one region where we know where the consumers are that we're trying to target. So the first thing we do is we work out what are the most attractive cities at a city level, and then we go into those cities and we have a look at, right, so where are those consumers who are looking for a premium product, who value the premium product and are willing to pay more. And so what we know is there are markets within markets, as opposed to countries, there are markets within cities. And so take Dubai, for example. If you think about the total population of that city, there's 25% of the population that we would be talking to, not everyone in the city. So in terms of the consumer, definitely opportunities for growth. We've got reduced supply, and in the short term, further reduced supply. So it's increasingly important to make sure we target the right consumer, the premium consumer. And lastly, what does this all mean for you? So I talked about us doing research in many markets, and just 2 slides ago, I showed you in the UAE, within Dubai, we're talking to 25% of the people in the city as opposed to the total population. What we know about that 25% of people, when you ask them about lamb as a protein and we ask them what's important to them, we get some of the obvious things that we're pleased to see. It's tender, it's superior, it tastes delicious. But we also get consistent quality standards and the animal is well cared for. This is fairly consistent across markets, and like I said, this is an example of one. But if you think about that demand growth that we looked at earlier, and it's actually coming from the developing markets more so than the developed, it's increasingly important that we can differentiate our product from the commodity product, which they're willing to pay more for. And now here's a bit of an eyesore. You don't need to read all of this one, but the slide you were just looking at, this one summarises what it looks like across a few different countries. And I've spared your eyes, believe it or not. It only has the top 5 things that a consumer considers important when they're paying a premium for protein. So this is when, before they make the choice of which protein they're going to buy, they've already decided that they're going to pay a premium, it's a special occasion, or they're a premium consumer. These are the top 5 things across multiple markets that they say are important. And I've highlighted those in yellow, blue and green because we've already heard this afternoon about some of the opportunities, and we're going to hear more this afternoon and more tomorrow morning about what you can do to deliver against these things. So consistent quality, animal well cared for, environmentally sustainable and guaranteed safety. It comes up across markets, and like I said earlier, this is just a sample of markets that we do research. So what's important to the consumer is all related to our production practices and the product that we deliver to the consumer. Things like consistent quality, safety, taste delicious, and animal is well cared for are all related. And in terms of understanding our consumer, like I said earlier, when we looked at the global environment, understanding our export destinations is critical to providing a competitive advantage. Up on the screen are some examples of the types of data that we collect and we continually trawl to understand who it is that we're targeting, how we remain competitive in the global markets. So it's all about producing Australian lamb to meet the premium consumers' needs. If we're thinking about targeting the global consumer, the things to keep in mind, it's a dynamic world marketplace. There are two major exporters and we're one of those. There are opportunities for growth, but with reduced supply, it's critical to target the right consumer, it's the premium consumer, and to produce Australian lamb that meets the needs of those consumers. Before I finish up, I know this side of MLA Insights is probably something that's lesser known to many people. Anyone that's brave enough to jump on the internet and look at our website, there's a section called Prices and Markets, and then there's a section about international markets, and you'll find high-level information about the international markets on there. I think we tend not to share that data as much as we do the supply data. So thank you.
Thanks, Nat. Really good, I think, for us to start this session with a strong focus on the consumer. And got a couple of questions about to come up, very capably managed over there by Karis. Thank you, Karis. Okay, so there's one putting you right on farm. If you were a sheep breeder, what would you be focusing on?
I was a sheep breeder, what would I be focusing on?
That's going to drag you out of your comfort zone.
Yeah, possibly. But I did have the benefit of sitting through the last session. And I know it was referenced, I think, in maybe 3 times about the eating quality. So I know from a breeder or a producer point of view, it's referred to as many things, but when a consumer says consistent eating quality, they just literally mean, I want to go and I want to buy it, I want to take it home and I want to cook it, and then the next time I go and do that, I want the same result that I got last time. So they describe it fairly simplistically, but it is very, very important. And you saw on that slide, when we ask them about when they're paying a premium, it's in the top 5 in most countries.
Okay, thank you. So on to the second one there, market competition. What happens to domestic supply if exports are worth more to the processors?
I don't know about the part about worth more to processors, but if you think about that slide that I had up about demand, I think it was the second slide in, and we had a look at where the demand growth was coming from, and you had the developing markets was relatively steady, but then you had the big red bars where demand was increasing. Australia's in that developing markets region, so, sorry, developed. Thank you for that. Developed. So in terms of growth, there's very, very targeted growth in the domestic market, don't get me wrong, but the size of growth is bigger elsewhere. And in terms of price to processor, I can't actually comment on that, except that Australia is still the most valuable market.
Domestically is still the most valuable market.
Yeah.
And I guess that leads also into the question above that one, with respect to being able to meet demand for growing global meat consumption.
Will we be able to meet? No. Well, so based on global demand, so you think of current demand that exists right now, our supply wouldn't meet it. I've put this really simplistic equation, wrongly or rightly, where if you think of the world population being somewhere around 7 billion, and you think about the excess meat that we produce that gets exported, it equates to about another 30 million people if they all ate as much as Australians did. So there's, a $7 billion group of people for which we're just looking for 30 million of them. So no, we wouldn't meet global demand.
I think, Jamie, you gave us a number earlier today. The average American eats half a kilo. So I reckon there's people in this room, that's probably their annual, what they have when they sit down to each meal. So it wouldn't take a lot of growth there, I imagine, to really stretch our supply in a big market. Cooking styles. Do we have much information around how the cooking styles differ and how that impacts our market access and the acceptance of our lamb and sheep meat?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a wide range of cooking styles when you think about our consumer and it being a global consumer. You've got markets like the Middle East where the traditional method of cooking probably involves 3 different cooking styles. There'll be, boiling, baking, grilling, all for the one dish. And you see that when you have a look at what we're exporting, what cuts we export to what markets, it does vary.
Now, looking specifically at China, we've been able to plot what's happened in their flock over the years, and our question is assuming that it's increasing given the consumption that you've shown on earlier slides.
Yeah, yep. So I don't know exactly over the last 20 years, but certainly I do have a chart, of course I have a chart, that shows their production versus their consumption, and where the 2 lines actually used to be on top of each other, if you could picture. More recently they've separated. Now that is the consumption being higher than the production. I don't know how much you all know, but it's a very, very different market to Australia in terms of the fluctuations that they see and the mass exodus from one species to another as soon as a price rises or falls, and many, many small producers. But yeah, the gap, which is the important part between production and consumption, has widened.
I might just expand on the China question, if I may, Nat. In terms of the wealth growth in China, which we've seen reported over many years, and the growing middle and upper class, has that made some significant changes in the type of product they're buying from us?
It's probably the mix of products. Yeah, the type. There's a thing in between which impacts what we sell to China, and that's market access. So for lamb, it's almost all frozen, and we have limited access for chilled. But versus the competitors in the market, we certainly are a premium. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. How are we going, Karis? Have we exhausted our texts? Rodney, have you got your thumbs warmed up? Have you need a question from the floor? There's a young fellow sitting next to you. I reckon he can probably text as quick as you can dictate. So we do have time for another question or two. If there is a question from the floor, we can whip a microphone out. No? Okay, well, Natalie will be with us for dinner, and I'm sure she'd be more than happy for you to quiz her on any more detail you might think of this afternoon. So if you could join me in thanking her for that presentation, please. Thanks,